I want to tell you about a number that changed the way I see the world. Not a headline number, not one of those figures that gets screamed in a chyron on cable news. I mean the kind of number you stumble across at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, buried in a footnote of a Bank of International Settlements report when you were supposed to be doing something else entirely. The number is $3.5 trillion. I remember reading it and literally saying out loud, to nobody, in an empty room, wait, that can't be right. Because here is what that number represents. It is Japan's net international investment position. The total value of all the assets that Japanese citizens, corporations and institutions own outside of Japan, minus what foreigners own inside Japan. The largest such number on earth. Larger than China's. Larger than Germany's. Larger than Saudi Arabia's. And Japan has held that title, largest net creditor nation on earth, for more than 3 consecutive decades.
A country that every serious newspaper, every economics professor, every Bloomberg anchor has described as being in a state of permanent stagnation since 1990 has, in that same period, quietly built a $3.5 trillion empire of foreign assets. That does not make sense, until it does. And when it does, everything you thought you understood about how global power works starts to feel slightly embarrassing. We are taught to look at maps. It is a child's way of understanding power. We look at the vast red expanse of China, and then we look at the thin, curved crescent of Japan, and we feel like we understand who is dominant and who is fragile. We see the drone footage of Shenzhen glittering at night, the high-speed rail networks threading through mountains, the naval exercises in the Taiwan Strait, and we compare them to the quiet, graying suburbs of Osaka, the stagnant stock markets, the headlines about deflation.
The public narrative has been written for 30 years. Japan is a spent force, a cautionary tale, a society slowly shrinking into irrelevance, while China is the inevitable hegemon, the industrial engine that will rewrite the global order. It is a very clean, very convincing story, and it is almost entirely wrong. If you want to understand how the global machine actually works, you cannot look at the map. You have to look at the plumbing, the flow of capital, the ownership of foreign assets, the quiet collateralization of debt, the deep, unsexy compromises made behind closed doors decades before you were paying attention. When you look there, you realize something that should be obvious, but somehow never, is Japan did not lose the economic war of the late 20th century. They simply changed the game they were playing. They realized, before almost anyone else, that occupying physical territory and building the biggest steel mills is a 19th century way of projecting power.
The real game is owning the wealth of the people who think they rule you. Let us go back to September 1985. 5 men in a single room at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The finance ministers of the United States, West Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Japan. No press conference. No cameras. The kind of meeting where history is rearranged quietly, like furniture. America had a problem. A massive trade deficit. A surging dollar that was destroying its domestic manufacturing sector. The fix was blunt force Japan and West Germany to appreciate their currencies. The Japanese agreed because they had no real choice. 5 men in a hotel room on a Saturday afternoon rewrote the map of global finance. The yen doubled in value against the dollar in under 2 years. The conventional history says this was the beginning of the end for Japan. The strong yen crushed exports. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to compensate.
Cheap money created the most spectacular asset bubble of the 20th century. The Tokyo real estate market in 1989, where the land under the Imperial Palace was theoretically worth more than all of California. Then it popped. The Nikkei lost half its value. The banks were paralyzed by bad debt. Japan spent the next decade and a half in a gray fog of stagnation. That is the story you read in textbooks. Here is what actually happened. When the yen skyrocketed, the Japanese corporate and political elite did not sit in Tokyo and weep. They looked at their newly powerful currency and realized they had just been handed a discount coupon for the entire planet. If a dollar-denominated asset suddenly cost half as much in yen terms as it did a year ago, the logical move was not to keep building expensive factories on expensive land inside Japan. The logical move was to build the factory somewhere else and keep the profits flowing home. So they did.
They constructed an entire parallel industrial civilization across Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and, yes, the American Midwest. When a Toyota rolls off the line in Georgetown, Kentucky, it does not appear in Japan's gross domestic product. It appears in America's. But the dividends, the royalties, the licensing fees for the intellectual property, those flow straight back to Tokyo. Japan externalized its economy. They grasped what most governments still have not in a globalized world. Domestic GDP is a vanity metric. The thing that matters is gross national income, what your citizens own, regardless of where on the globe those assets happen to be. While the Western financial press was writing Japan's obituary, Japanese corporations were quietly purchasing the supply chains of Southeast Asia, acquiring technology firms in Silicon Valley and Stuttgart, and buying hundreds of billions in US Treasury bonds, not out of politeness.
Because it gave them structural leverage over the countries they appeared to be subordinate to. I want to be honest about something here, because I think intellectual honesty is more interesting than a clean argument. For a long time, I bought the decline narrative completely. I remember, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, reading a long essay, one of those very confident, very well-sourced pieces about how Japan was essentially finished as a serious economic actor. The birth rate, the debt, the deflation, the zombie corporations. The argument was airtight. I forwarded it to 3 people. I probably would have cited it confidently in a conversation. Then, a few years later, I started following the capital flow data seriously. And I had this slow, creeping, genuinely uncomfortable realization I had been confusing the theater with the performance.
I had been watching the dramatic visible stuff, the stagnant wages, the shrinking population, the weird vending machines everywhere, and completely missing the invisible machinery that was doing the actual work. That is the mistake I want to help you avoid. Because the next 30 years of global power are going to be decided by people who understand the invisible machinery. Now contrast Japan's path with the one China chose. China watched the Japanese experience of the late 1980s and drew a very specific conclusion. To Beijing, the Plaza Accord was a trap, a deliberate, coordinated Western mechanism for neutralizing a rising Asian competitor by forcing currency appreciation and destabilizing their industrial base. They vowed they would never let that happen to them. They would never allow the West to dictate the value of their currency.
They would build an economic model so self-contained, so fortified, so reliant on domestic industrial capacity, that no group of finance ministers in a New York hotel room could touch it. So they chose the opposite path. Instead of externalizing their wealth, they internalized everything. They built a physical industrial fortress. In practice, this meant a single, brutal algorithm running for 30 years suppress domestic consumption, keep the currency artificially cheap, subsidize manufacturing past the point of any rational return, and pour the trade surpluses into physical infrastructure. If there was a problem, the answer was always more concrete, more steel, more high-speed rail, more apartment complexes. There is something almost admirable about the sheer commitment of it, until you notice what it required destroying to function. It worked spectacularly well for a while. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a historical eye blink.
It created the genuine illusion of an unstoppable, monolithic industrial machine. But there is always a catch when you try to bend the laws of financial physics. When you suppress consumption to fund investment-led growth, you have to put that investment somewhere. In the early years, you build roads and ports and power grids that genuinely multiply economic output. But eventually, you run out of productive things to build. And because your entire political system is organized around hitting GDP growth targets, because local party officials get promoted or purged based on growth numbers, you cannot stop. So you keep building. You build cities for people who do not exist. High-speed rail lines to villages with no economic output. A real estate sector that eventually accounts for nearly 30% of your entire economic activity. And how do you fund all this? Not with foreign capital. You have strict capital controls because you are terrified of losing control of your exchange rate.
You fund it by taking the savings of the Chinese middle class, paying them artificially low interest rates in state-controlled banks, and funneling that money to state-owned enterprises and local government shell companies to build concrete projects that yield zero financial return. It is a closed loop, a domestic debt machine that feeds on itself. Let me give you the actual scale of this, because the official numbers are designed to obscure it. China's official national debt looks relatively manageable, nothing like Japan's. But the official number is essentially a work of creative fiction. When you include the off-balance sheet debt of local governments, the opaque financing vehicles they use to bypass borrowing limits, the real figure is somewhere between $9 and $10 trillion of hidden debt. Debt that was used to build infrastructure that will never, ever generate enough revenue to service the interest payments.
Here is the mechanism, and I genuinely cannot decide whether it is more funny or terrifying. A local mayor has a growth target to hit. He cannot raise taxes easily, so he sets up a shell company, a local government financing vehicle. This shell company borrows billions from a state bank at subsidized rates. It then uses that borrowed money to buy a piece of land from the local government at an absurdly inflated price. The government declares revenue. The mayor gets a promotion. The shell company builds another empty apartment complex with the land as collateral. The bank carries the loan on its books as performing. Everybody wins. Until the apartment does not sell. Until the loan rolls over 3 times. Until the land is worth 60% of the collateral value. Until the state bank is sitting on a mountain of debt it cannot acknowledge without triggering a panic. It is a financial perpetual motion machine, except perpetual motion machines do not exist. And eventually you run out of land.
You run out of people willing to buy the 4th empty apartment in a city with no jobs. And you are left with a mountain of debt and 1,000 concrete towers literally peeling apart in the humidity. Japan looked at the early version of this trap in the late 1980s and said quietly, "No thank you." This is where the two paths diverge in a way that is almost elegant in its cruelty. Japan has a national debt to GDP ratio of over 260%. The financial media loves this number. They point to it as proof of Japan's inevitable collapse, usually in articles that have been recycled, essentially unchanged, since approximately 2003. But here is the question they consistently forget to ask: who owns that debt? Over 90% of Japanese government bonds are owned by the Japanese themselves. Domestic banks, pension funds, the Bank of Japan. It is debt denominated in their own currency, owned by their own institutions.
Japan is, in the most literal financial sense, a nation that owes money to itself, a very rich man who borrowed from his own savings account. China's situation is structurally opposite. On paper, China is a major creditor. They hold enormous foreign exchange reserves, mostly in US Treasury bonds. But these are not privately owned assets that Chinese citizens can access freely. They are political assets held by the state, and they are denominated in foreign currencies, which means they are vulnerable to exactly what happened to Russia in 2022. If Beijing makes a geopolitical move that the West considers unacceptable, those reserves can be frozen with a keystroke. The money is there on the balance sheet, but the key is in someone else's pocket. Meanwhile, the Chinese middle class has roughly 70% of its household wealth locked in real estate, a market that is currently in a slow-motion demolition that the state is desperately trying to manage.
Because of capital controls, ordinary Chinese citizens cannot easily move that wealth abroad, the way Japanese citizens and corporations have done for 40 years. They are trapped inside a deflating bubble with no exit. Here is where it gets genuinely painful to think about, and I say that not for effect, but because the demographic numbers are the one part of this story I kept hoping I was reading wrong. Japan's demographic crisis is one of the most cited facts in global economics. Sub-replacement birth rate for 50 years, population shrinking, labor force drying up. We are meant to understand this as a uniquely Japanese failure, a cultural peculiarity, a society that somehow forgot how to reproduce. But wait, China enforced a one-child policy with the full coercive apparatus of the state for 36 years. The result is that China is currently experiencing the most rapid demographic collapse of any major economy in recorded history. Their fertility rate is now lower than Japan's.
Their working-age population peaked around 2015 and is now in structural freefall. Same problem, completely different financial context. When Japan began to age seriously in the 1990s, their GDP per capita was already above $40,000. They had a complete social safety net, fully built-out infrastructure, and a global financial engine already generating passive income. They could afford a gentle managed decline, automate the factories, invest in robotics and elder care technology, let the foreign asset income carry the weight. China is getting old before it gets rich. Their GDP per capita is still around $12,000. There is no functional national pension system. Healthcare infrastructure in rural areas is decades behind. And because they spent 30 years funneling national savings into unproductive concrete rather than building a global financial cushion, there is no buffer.
They are going to face a demographic crisis with the financial toolkit of a middle-income country. Japan faced the same crisis with the toolkit of the world's largest net creditor. This is not a small difference. This is the difference between a controlled landing and hitting the runway sideways. The energy picture tells the same story, just with different geography, and the same uncomfortable conclusion. Neither Japan nor China has significant domestic oil or gas reserves. Both are almost entirely dependent on sea lanes threading through the Indo-Pacific. Every barrel of oil from the Persian Gulf must pass through the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea to keep the lights on in Tokyo or Shanghai. Japan's solution embed itself entirely within the American security architecture. Host U.S. bases. Integrate the Maritime Self-Defense Force with the U.S. Navy.
In exchange for accepting this humiliating formalization of its military subordination, Japan got to spend less than 1% of GDP on defense for 60 years and redirect those hundreds of billions into industrial development and foreign asset acquisition. China's solution challenged the American security order: build a blue water navy, militarize artificial islands, develop sophisticated anti-access systems designed to push US carriers out of the Western Pacific. Here is the problem. By doing so, they pushed every single neighbor closer to Washington. Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan all drew nearer to the United States as a direct result of China's military expansion. China now faces a ring of allied containment around its coastline that it spent enormous treasure helping to construct. And even with their enormous military investment, they still cannot secure their energy supply lines.
In any serious conflict, the United States Navy can simply enforce a blockade at the Malacca Strait, a geographic choke point they cannot control, and China's industrial economy begins shutting down within weeks. The Belt and Road Initiative was partly designed to create land-based energy alternatives pipelines from Russia, from Central Asia, through Pakistan. I spent some time genuinely believing this was the elegant workaround, the strategic stroke of genius that would let China sidestep its maritime vulnerability. Then I actually looked at the numbers. Those pipelines, even at theoretical maximum capacity, supply a fraction of China's daily energy needs. They are extraordinarily expensive to build and maintain, vulnerable to interdiction, and they create a deep structural dependence on Russia, which is currently fighting a land war in Europe with a conscript army and running out of serious industrial capacity. That is not a partnership.
That is two people clinging to the same piece of wreckage. I need to say something about the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, because the mainstream geopolitical coverage of it has been, in my view, one of the great analytical failures of the last decade. The standard narrative presents it as a masterfully executed grand strategy, a Chinese plan to buy the developing world with infrastructure loans, creating a network of tributary states beholden to Beijing, bypassing American financial power, and establishing the architecture of a new Chinese-led global order. That framing is seductive. It is also completely backwards. The Belt and Road Initiative was not a long-term master plan. It was a panic response to a domestic problem. By 2013, China's internal investment model had run out of road. They had built so many roads, bridges, ports, and apartments inside China that their state-owned construction companies and steel mills were facing existential overcapacity.
If they stopped building, millions of workers would lose jobs in a matter of months, and local governments, already buried in hidden debt, would face immediate insolvency. So they needed somewhere else to dump the concrete. They went to Central Asia, Africa, and South Asia, and offered massive loans for infrastructure. But these were not gifts of strategic genius. They were loans designed to keep Chinese construction companies employed, using Chinese materials, building projects that were frequently economically unviable in the host countries. And now the bills are due. Dozens of Belt and Road recipient countries are in severe debt distress. Zambia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. They cannot pay back the loans. But China cannot afford to write off the debt because their own domestic banks are already drowning in bad real estate loans. So Beijing is forced to roll over the debt, issue emergency bailouts, and throw good money after catastrophically bad. It is not a colonial empire.
It is a globe-spanning subprime mortgage crisis, with Beijing playing the role of the overextended lender. I will admit something here. I find this harder to write than the economic mechanics. Because behind those debt numbers are real people. A pot worker in Hambantota who did not choose any of this. A farmer in Zambia whose country's foreign policy is now partially collateral. The BRI was not evil genius. But its failure is not abstract either. I think it is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving on. Meanwhile, Japan has been quietly playing an entirely different game in the same regions for 40 years. Japanese institutions do not offer predatory loans for vanity projects. They invest in human capital, regulatory frameworks, and genuine supply chain integration. When a Southeast Asian government needs to build a semiconductor packaging plant or a high-quality port facility, they frequently choose Japanese partners, even at higher initial cost. Because Japanese projects actually work. without hidden political strings, and without bankrupting the host country.
Japan is playing a game of long, slow, structural trust building. China is playing a game of loud, short-term leverage. The uncomfortable truth is that trust, accumulated quietly over decades, is worth more in international economic relationships than any number of billion-dollar loans. Let me tell you about August 2024, because I think it is the most important single data point that almost nobody understood correctly when it happened. In the first week of August 2024, global financial markets experienced one of the fastest and most violent sell-offs in years. The Japanese yen spiked sharply. The VIX, the market's fear gauge, hit levels not seen since the COVID shock. Major technology stocks dropped 10 to 15% in a matter of days. The whole thing lasted less than 2 weeks before markets recovered, and most people filed it under volatility event and moved on. Here is what actually happened. The Bank of Japan raised interest rates by a quarter point.
A single modest, well-telegraphed rate hike. That is all it took, because for 30 years, global investors had been running what is called the yen carry trade. Borrow in yen at near zero interest rates. Convert those yen to dollars or euros or Australian dollars. Invest in higher yielding assets. Collect the spread. Repeat at enormous scale. This was not a niche strategy. It was the hidden plumbing underneath a significant portion of global financial risk-taking. Hedge funds, investment banks, pension funds. Everyone was in the pool to varying degrees. When the Bank of Japan signaled that the era of zero rates might finally be ending, the calculation changed. Suddenly, the cost of yen borrowing was going up. You had to unwind. Sell the foreign assets, buy back the yen, close the position. And when everyone tries to do that simultaneously, the yen spikes, foreign assets crater, and the shock wave ripples through every leveraged position in the global system. In 2 weeks.
From a quarter-point interest rate move, in a country the world had written off as irrelevant. That is what real systemic leverage looks like. Not aircraft carriers, not infrastructure loans. A quiet central banker in Tokyo adjusting a single number by 25%, and the New York Stock Exchange drops 10%. Now let me give you the mental model that I think clarifies all of this. Think about two people. The first one is on Instagram right now. You know this person. Gold watch, possibly rented. Matte black Lamborghini in the background, definitely leased. Captions about building an empire and discipline separates the rich from the poor. The video has 3 million views. He looks powerful. He looks like the future. The second one is his neighbor, 62 years old. Faded New Balance sneakers. Drives a 20-year-old Volvo station wagon. Buys his coffee at Costco in bulk. If you passed him on the street, you would feel mildly sorry for him. He looks like someone the world passed by.
But here is the thing. The quiet neighbor owns the land under the influencer's apartment building. He owns the leasing company that holds the Lamborghini's title. He holds the paper on the influencer's business loan. And the influencer is 4 months behind on the rent, paying the interest on a credit card he hid from his accountant. That is the relationship between China and Japan in the global financial system right now. Except the stakes are $3.5 trillion. And the quiet neighbor's health is not great. I fell for the Instagram version. I am not ashamed to admit that. 7 or 8 years ago, I looked at those drone videos of Shenzhen at midnight. The towers, the light show, the sheer density of it, and I felt something close to awe. I looked at maps of Belt and Road projects threading across 3 continents and thought this is what a new empire looks like when it is being assembled. Then you look at the plumbing.
And you get this specific, slightly sickening feeling. Not of surprise exactly, but of recognition. Oh, this is the same story, different costumes, same machine. The United States is currently in the middle of a serious, genuine attempt to rebuild its domestic industrial base. The CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the aggressive tariff architecture. These are not temporary political gestures. They represent a structural, permanent shift in the global economic order. The era of hyper-globalization, where you could outsource manufacturing to wherever labor was cheapest and rely on frictionless global supply chains, is over. For China, this is not a problem. It is an existential threat. Their entire economic model assumes access to Western markets for their massive industrial overcapacity. If the West closes its doors, they cannot pivot to domestic consumption. They systematically suppress Chinese consumers' purchasing power for 3 decades to fund their investment model.
There is no domestic demand engine waiting to be switched on. For Japan, the deglobalization moment is not a threat. It is a second coronation. When the United States decided to rebuild its semiconductor supply chain, who did they call? They called TSMC and Samsung, yes. But they also called Tokyo Electron, Shinetsu Chemical, JSR, Sumco Canon. These are Japanese companies with near monopoly positions in the specialty chemicals, photomasks, silicon wafers, and deposition equipment that literally cannot be sourced anywhere else on Earth. You cannot build a modern semiconductor fabrication plant without Japanese technology. Full stop. There is no workaround. There is no Chinese alternative at scale. There is no American substitute. The supply chain runs through Tokyo. Warren Buffett understood this before most.
When Berkshire Hathaway began quietly accumulating large positions in the 5 major Japanese trading conglomerates, Itochu, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Marubeni, the financial press treated it as a curiosity. An elderly billionaire with a sentimental attachment to a country he had visited as a young man. What Buffett actually saw was the most underleveraged, undervalued collection of globally integrated industrial and resource assets on Earth, run by management teams with decades of institutional relationships across every commodity market and every manufacturing sector that matters. He was not buying nostalgia. He was buying the plumbing at a discount. I want to end with the most dangerous gear in this entire machine, the one that keeps me up at night far more than any military buildup or any political election. The Bank of Japan is currently in the early stages of normalizing its monetary policy, cautiously, slowly, after 30 years of zero or negative interest rates.
And as we saw in August 2024, even a small, tentative, heavily telegraphed move in that direction is enough to send shockwaves through the entire global financial system. Now imagine not a quarter-point move. Imagine a full normalization cycle. Interest rates moving from near zero to 2 or 3% over several years, as Japan's economy gradually warms, as inflation finally returns, as an aging population demands returns on its savings. Every step of that process drains the yen carry trade. Every step means global investors unwinding leverage positions in Western tech stocks, emerging market debt, real estate, and the shadow banking infrastructure that has grown up over the last 15 years. And simultaneously, a Japan that has become more expensive in yen terms starts redirecting some of its massive foreign asset income toward domestic uses, paying for the largest eldercare crisis in history, funding a manufacturing renaissance, repatriating capital.
That repatriation does not have to be dramatic to be devastating. Even a partial gradual shift in where Japan directs its capital flows will have effects that no central bank in Washington or Brussels is fully prepared for. Here is the uncomfortable truth. We have spent 30 years watching the wrong theater. We watched the parades in Beijing, the aircraft carriers threading through the Taiwan Strait, the grand declarations of a new multipolar world, and the inevitable decline of Western hegemony. We thought we were watching the rise of a new empire. And it was a genuinely compelling performance. But real power does not parade. Real power does not hold press conferences announcing its inevitability. Real power is the quiet, invisible ownership of the debt and the infrastructure of your rivals. It is the ability to sit in the corner for 30 years, watching the machine run, saying very little, because you are the one who owns the plumbing. And you know that the plumbing always wins.
Japan chose to be the plumbing. China chose to be the most impressive building anyone had ever seen. And the building's foundation is cracking, which leaves us with the question that almost no one in Washington, Beijing, or London is willing to say out loud. What happens to the global balance of power when the Chinese debt machine finally runs out of concrete? When the apartment towers are empty and the local governments are insolvent, and the middle class realizes their savings have been spent on infrastructure that will never earn a return, and the only entity with the liquidity, the structural leverage, and the institutional relationships to quietly purchase the wreckage at a discount over years without fanfare is the silent empire across the Sea of Japan. The quiet neighbor has been waiting a very long time. He is patient. He is old, and he owns more than you think. The question is not whether he has the power to reshape the global order. The question is whether he will choose to before he runs out of time.